Chapter 29, Korok Forest. By morning, Zelda had forgotten the music. In fact, she had forgotten everything after the moment where she had reached out to touch Link's mind. She had an impression that she had experienced some pain but could not recall it well enough to say for sure. Selective amnesia, perhaps? Did that suggest that her general amnesia was, itself, a defense mechanism? She had suspected that more than once, but the question came up again and she was left wondering about it for most of the morning. When Zelda rose, the first thing she did was visit the other nooks in the Deku Tree's interior with Paya. She was surprised, though not very much, to find that the Koroks had prepared for her coming by converting these spaces into makeshift shops. The idea that the Koroks normally participated in anything resembling commerce was preposterous on its face. They could subsist on sunlight and water, Zelda suspected, or perhaps even less than that, but if this was a game to them then they were playing it for the sake of her comfort. The shot full of mushrooms she had bought out without really thinking about it, because all of the gathered specimens were very useful, and when she'd handed her rupees over to the proprietor it had thanked her loudly, washed back into a corner. The jingling of its steps was made louder by the currency it could barely hold, and dropped all of the rupees onto the floor. It swept them together into a somewhat neater pile, nodded at its handiwork, and returned to its place. Zelda and Paya watched this ritual in amused silence. The second shop was full of food and arrows, and when Zelda saw that there were multiple bundles of 5 shock arrows she tested one with her fingertip. It insisted on its own reality by sending a shock up her arm that nearly made her shoulder seize. "Where did you get these?" she asked, shaking her hand and fighting the urge to blow cool air across her finger. "I found them." It beamed behind its sad leaf mask. "Oh, yes, that makes sense." She tried to imagine where it had found this wealth of weaponry, spent several seconds deciding whether to press the point. She reached for her wallet instead. "Zelda," Paya said, the voice low enough that the Korok probably couldn't hear, "we are spending quite a lot here." She had apparently assumed that Zelda had decided to buy out the stock of the store, too, or at least its arrows. Well, if that's what she thought, she was right. "That may be. Still, we have a bit of a surplus. Don't we?" "Surplus? My apologies, but I don't understand." "When Robbie made the ancient armor and all of those weapons for me, he never charged me anything, even though the cost listed in the ancient oven for all of those items would have totaled as much as a small house. I had been gathering gemstones in anticipation of an expense of that magnitude, but it never came up. So, we have a surplus of value, don't we? I might as well spend some of it. You might need those rupees later." "Not we," Zelda noticed. "Perhaps. But that's why I never miss the opportunity to shatter an ore deposit. I think I can keep us flush, should we start to run low, so we have plenty to trade here." A thought occurred to her, and she paused before putting it into the air between them. "Still, it's clear that the Koroks are not used to dealing with merchants. I wonder what they'll do with the rupees when we're done." The proprietor of the general shop, who was standing much more closely behind them than Zelda had thought, said, "I'm gonna bury them." Zelda and Paya both stared at the long-faced Korok. Zelda prompted, "Bury them?" "Yeah. Or maybe hide them. You know? I'll put one under a rock. Then somebody will pick up the rock and find it, and they'll say, 'Hey, a rupee. Who put that there?' And you know what?" It waved one of its arm stubs toward its face. "It was me. I put it there." There was no more deliberation. They bought out the contents of the general shop, too. Now that she knew that the Deku Tree's face was, in fact, a face, Zelda could see it and attribute bearing and emotion to it. It struck her as fabulously wise, like the drawing a particularly skilled child might produce if asked to draw a person with deep experience and knowledge. There was more to the Deku Tree's face than that. Though he was not very animated, the guardian of the woods, but he still had expressions. They simply passed over his face slowly enough that most people wouldn't be able to register them. Zelda stepped again onto the raised platform where the Master Sword had stood, Paya following close behind her, and looked up at the Deku Tree. He did not immediately acknowledge her, which would not have struck her as strange. Who could say what was usual to a god of the woods? But some part of her senses was still awake, reaching out, filling in the gaps in her own thoughts. The Deku Tree was exerting some great effort, unless she was mistaken. He was in pain. "Great Deku Tree, she said, and his eyes did not open but his face shifted, on a scale large enough that she could see the change. "What troubles you?" The Deku-tree huffed in amusement, and his pain was obvious even in that sound. "Not a thought to the pain that you suffered yesterday, Princess. Have you no other questions for me?" "Other questions can wait," she said. She tried to be firm, as ridiculous as that felt. "What's wrong?" "The wood," he said, and the shadow of his pain hung over his words, "is a place of refuge. Thus has it been since long before the calamity. Thus has it been, always. My power is that power." The wind rustled his leaves far above their heads, making a sound like heavy rainfall. "Ganon has been seeking to spread its power throughout the land for a century, and the hero cannot contain that power. It has fallen to the wood to be the refuge of Hyrule and Tyre, to the Koroks, to keep the calamity from propagating its malice." The sound of an ancient song sung on a mountaintop rang in her thoughts. So that was what was happening on Mount Laniru. The Koroks were using the power of the forest to combat the malice that had infected nature. "As observant as I expected," the Deku-tree answered. He was silent for several seconds. Then, "The Korok forest is the safest place in Hyrule. It is a place for you to rest and recover, but it is also more than that. Here, if nowhere else, you are safe from the eyes of the calamity. Here, if nowhere else, you may be the entirety of yourself without Ganon's attentions falling on you." The entirety. The scope of what that meant seemed absurd, but she also understood that it was absolutely true. She could hold the fullness of the power here and Ganon would not see it at all. That thought nearly made her reach down into herself and seize hold of her strength, the weight of her curiosity tugging insistently at her will. What? No. The curiosity was anchored somewhere else. Thirst. She squared her shoulders and looked up at the Deku-tree squarely. "Great Deku-tree, please. There were so many more Koroks living in this wood a century ago. You are in pain so terrible that I can feel echoes of it inside myself. What has happened? What is happening? Are the children of the forest in danger?" The shadow of pain did not pass from the Deku-tree's voice or from its face, but he turned his attention to Zelda, wholly, for the first time in a day. That regard made her realize she had been a fool. She could no more read the expressions of that ancient face than she could the expression of Death Mountain. Would she understand better when she held Hylia's power? She suspected she would. The Deku-tree said, "You will not stop seeking an answer until I give one to you. It has always been so, for those bearing Hylia's blood. But I think it has never been truer than for you." He sighed, seemed to gather himself. "To assuage your fears, no. The children of the forest have not dwindled in the intervening century. They are children, and I would wither and dry before I let a single one of them come to harm. Oh, but that is not as deep as your fear goes, is it? You will not be satisfied until you know what is different compared to yesterday, and why, and you will not know to your satisfaction until you perceive it directly. Perhaps that is well. Open your mind to mine, and I will show you." She should have been ashamed, she knew, for forcing a further burden upon the ancient spirit who strained with the effort to protect the land that had suffered in her absence, to heap higher the troubles he supported in his vows. Still, she wasn't when she grabbed some small part of the power, just enough to open up her senses and widen her thoughts. She was glad. The presence of the Deku-tree was enormous, on a magnitude not unlike a god, but his gentleness was so pronounced that she feared his attentions not at all. She reached out to him, and their minds touched, and she saw. Atop the sanctum of Hyrule Castle, where the ruined thrones of the royal family lay in rubble, a storm raged. All black and purple, shot through with lightning of an even darker hue, the whirling mass of malice breathed like a living thing, seeking to press against the boundaries set upon it. If left unchecked it would have spread through the sky, blanketing the land from above as the bleeding earth blanketed it from below. A century passed. Pools of malice had infested Hyrule like the boils brought on by some long-extinct disease. The return of the calamity's power had scattered its hatred in waves, and almost as soon as it had landed the malice had begun to spread, eating away at soil and life. In another time, the malice would have been rendered inert by the power of the blood of Hylia, but this was not that time, not that life, and the hero's power could not be so leveraged. Life had responded, and the children of the forest had gone out in droves, bringing with them the light that had stood in every land before demons had walked the surface of the earth. With light and magic and dancing and singing they had surrounded the malice, had channeled the power of the forest into it, and bit by bit they had swept the darkness away. The calamity could not sense them. They moved and acted against it without it even knowing that its hold on the land had grown narrower. For a century they had worked. Now they, in their hundreds, danced atop the highest parapets of the castle, filling the air with light and noise. All that remained was here, and they would hold it. They didn't sing just for the malice. Of course they sang for the hero, too. They sang high and loud, so he would always know they were cheering for him and they believed in him. When the sword raised its voice they joined in, singing the song of the hero to help him remember how brave he was, and how important it was to be brave. They hoped he heard them. They would keep going even if he didn't. That was the song they were singing now, 100 years later. They had joined their voices to the swords what seemed like a very, very long time ago. They could sing for hours or days without stopping, but holding to one song was difficult for them. Their attention wandered, and they wanted to sing other things. Each of them was focused because they knew they had to sing for Mr. Hero, but each of them felt the time pass. At last, one Korok stopped singing, and turned to the next one on its right. "It's never taken this long before," it said, and the singing stopped in a wave as this was repeated and spread throughout the group. Their green light remained, but they had stopped singing and dancing. Here was a problem they had never encountered. Maybe he's tired. Maybe we should sing louder. We're singing really loud. Something might be wrong. The storm raged overhead, but they barely heard it. They looked at each other as the thought processed differently for each of them. Something might be wrong. The roof of the sanctum had been torn away by one of Ganon's rages decades ago, so all of them could see the dark pit that ended in the chamber where the battle raged. It was too far down to see, though not to hear. So, they heard it when Ganon roared, drowning out the song of the sword. They had heard that sound many times, and each of those many times they had trembled, and this time was no exception. Their faces quivered on the fronts of their bodies, and each of them huddled with their neighbors for physical security. The protection of the forest was on them, but in this moment that protection seemed small. Then Link screamed, his voice one long note of pain and exhaustion and defiance. As a body they looked around at each other. They had heard Link scream before, too, but never like that. Never so much pain, so much feeling. Something was different, even if they couldn't articulate what. Something was wrong. What do we do? Do we get help? It's been a whole day. The singing isn't working. Mr. Hero isn't getting back up. Is he going to lose? Is Ganon going to win? Mr. Hero always wins. What if he doesn't win? One of them, its leaf small and green and shaped like a single petal from a cherry blossom, walked over to the edge. All of its fellows hushed again, watched, listened. The roar faded. The scream faded. The song continued. The hero did not rise. The single Korok said, "We have to help Mr. Hero." Then it jumped into the hole. A second followed it. A fourth. A 14th. "We have to help Mr. Hero." "Hold on, Mr. Hero. We're coming." "Mr. Hero! Mr. Hero! Mr. Hero!" As a crowd, in their hundreds, the Koroks leaped into the darkness, descending on spinning leaves or on nothing at all, shouting their courage in children's voices as they fell toward the sounds of apocalypse. Zelda grabbed hold of the power in two enormous fistfuls and thrust them out directly into the Deku Tree, seeking to bolster his strength, to lend him the power he might need, to make sure that whatever was about to happen did not turn into catastrophe. And then she slammed into a wall, so firm and vast that she began to understand, deep within herself, how powerful the Deku Tree actually was. "I believe you will need all of your strength for yourself, Princess of Hyrule." The Deku Tree's voice was strained, but he still managed to sound amused. "Pray, do not squander it in seeking to bolster mine." She was still holding the power, not within herself but ready to use like a tool or a weapon, and in physical space she was bathed in golden light that made the air around her seem darker by comparison. Haya was staring at her, slack-jawed, but Zelda could not pay mind to that. "Please let me help you. Please. If anything should happen to any of them, Nothing will happen to them." The tree's voice was firm, now, and his bow seemed to dance over his head. "Though I will be drained by what is to come, no child of the forest will suffer so long as I live." Do not concern yourself. I have been protecting these woods and the Koroks for many, many, many years. A pause, as he considered what to say next, or perhaps he was gathering his strength. It was impossible to tell. I should hope I will be able to last for the weeks or months it will take for you to be ready to face Ganon. If the situation is so urgent, if Link is beginning to falter and the Koroks are coming to his aid, she said so that Paya would be able to understand. Then should I not go to do battle now? Are we not running out of time? No. That word echoed across the entire forest, stilling the air and all the noises of the wood. No. Link will not falter. He suffers, which frightens the children of the forest, but he will not fall. Some change is taking place in his battle with Ganon, but I have faith that the hero has not yet reached the limit of his endurance. More than that, though, you are not yet fully awakened to your power. If you were as strong today as you were a century ago, I would not have been able to close myself to you just now. Zelda let go of the power, and the light around her went out. She tried not to slouch, but reality pulled down at her more surely than the weight of stones. And Ganon is far more terrible than when it was unleashed. Yes. She wouldn't be able to do battle with Ganon by herself, even with all of Hylia's power. She still needed the champions. Whatever Link was suffering, she had to leave him to it. Whatever the Koroks were risking, she had to. She shivered, thinking of them crying out as they leaped into a battle they could not possibly understand. Ancient spirits they might have been, but when the Deku Tree called them children he was right. How they had spoken to her, how they had spoken of Link, haunted her. Great Deku Tree, why are you doing this? Why are they doing this? If you believe that Link will continue fighting regardless, why drain yourself so terribly? Why let the Koroks, if not risk themselves, then be witness to whatever horror is taking place in the castle? Why not call them away? They would not leave him, even if I were to command it, and I would not. Why? Slowly, with great effort, the Deku Tree once more turned a fullness of his attention toward the princess and her guard. She had the sense that he had split himself between two places, and it was exhausting for him to talk to her at all. I told you before that this place is safe, and that you can fully awaken here. If you want to understand why, allow yourself to be yourself. The urge to protest clawed its way up her throat, saw the vastness of the guardian of the forest, and died. As powerful as he was, he had existed here for a century without drawing Ganon's attention. He had, almost without doubt, presided over the ancient battles with the Calamity. Who in all the world would have the perspective to advise her, to be sure of what they were saying, if not he? I am afraid, she reflected, but not of Ganon, not right now. I'm afraid of stepping over something, crossing a threshold that I will not able to return from. The Deku Tree leveraged the fullness of his ancient strength, and on the other side of his efforts the Koroks defied the darkness, and she could not imagine it. If I do as the Deku Tree suggests, I may not be able to be myself again afterward. I may not even think to question it. The power can change me. Kai stood next to her, close to her, as if to catch her should she fall, or to grab hold of her should she begin to float away. She didn't need Hylia's power or awareness to read what her friend was thinking. Pai's hope, and trust, and enduring faith were written in every line of her face, in the set of her eyes. The power has changed me. I have used it in its fullness thrice, and anticipate thrice again what is once more. Zelda closed her eyes and reached down into herself, grabbing hold of the power. She encompassed all of it, would have been all of it, but she hesitated. Why was she hesitating? This was more than just fear of the moment or fear of change. She was on the edge of something else, some truth that the Deku Tree had alluded to, and at the moment where it mattered most she was not sure if she wanted to see. Zelda, said the Deku Tree, to know why the Koroks seek to protect the hero, you must understand how they relate to every hero through the ages. The power was a sun, warm and nourishing in her arms, and its light ran through the channels of her awareness, illuminating her, illuminating the world. The hero has always protected the wood, and the wood has always protected the hero. It has been thus through time immemorial, since long before the rise of the Calamity. The hero's raiment, for eons, has served as a symbol of this fellowship. She hadn't intended to take the power into herself, and for a moment wondered if the power had reached out for her, but no, it did not do such things. She had grabbed hold of it without knowing. A reflex, perhaps? An unspoken need which she could not, in good conscience, deny? Conscious of herself now, she drew the fullness of Hylia's strength into herself, held it, felt as if she contained the fullness of the world. The hero is not a spirit of the wood, but the wood knows the hero. Whether they be born on plains of grass, in the heart of roaring mountains, beneath cool waters, nestled atop shifting sands, or in the very sky itself. The world unfolded around her, though her eyes remained closed. The course of life was plain to her, the energy of life itself like molten gold that filled the background of her mind. The Deku Tree was as vast as Death Mountain before her, his ancient roots reaching so deep into the earth that his life force could not be easily distinguished from the living spirit of the land itself. The Koroks were bundles of stars wearing wood like a mask, and she understood that they had not always been this way, though they loved the shape perhaps best of all the ones they'd known. Paia reached out to her, not with her hand but with her heart, and Zelda reached out in return, letting Hylia's awareness fill the shaky ghost senses. Paia's sharp intake of breath was a ripple that spread through the world. Whatever happened, the two of them would experience it together. Something was coming. As her awareness filled out, coloring in the spaces that were left by her physical senses, she felt something enormous. The Deku Tree finish. Every hero is a child of the forest. Uncounted voices called out to her, "Open your eyes." She did. In their hundreds they were spread before her, mostly men, mostly Hylian, mostly wearing green, but people from every tribe and every walk of life, wearing every color the gods had seen fit with which to paint the world. A Goron wearing green painted armor with his arms crossed stood beneath the shade of the forest canopy, far from the mountain that had produced him. A Garuda with sad eyes took in the world for a second time, the weight of her battle with the calamity still dragging at her shoulders. A cetacean or a woman whose skin was the color of evergreen needles nearly blended into the foliage. They were echoes of the past made solid, as if they had reverberated with each other and with her until the echoes recalled the forms that had given birth to them. Every one of them, every hero since the first, was gathered under the boughs of the Deku Tree. After a few moments, while holding as much of the power and the perspective of Hylia as she was capable of, Zelda remembered to breathe. "Here is the secret," the Deku Tree said, and though his voice was strained, Zelda could hear beneath the crude reality of his effort, to the very heart of who he was, and he was vast and powerful. "Here is the truth that lies behind every battle with Ganon, and those who would be like Ganon, throughout time. No battle is fought alone," Paia said, because she shared in Zelda's perspective and was quicker to go along certain paths than Zelda herself, even now. "There is always the history of the battle behind us. The memory of those who came before. The legacy," Zelda said, and when the words left her mouth the Deku Tree sighed in relief and approval. Those words were all she could manage of herself. She had taken the fullness of Hylia's perspective, Hylia's memory, into her own thoughts. That perspective told her that the change was not permanent or did not have to be if she did not wish it so, but faced with the totality of the sight before her she did not have space in her mind to care. Memory flooded back to her, and she the goddess, she the oracle, she who had fought the calamity throughout the eons, knew each of them as intimately as she knew Paia. Better, in truth. Their shared history filled that place, filled her until she thought that she or the forest would break under its weight. They were looking at her, all of them, and they did not judge or fear or seethe. Some carried sorrows, or regrets, or pain, but all of them looked at her and they hoped. They believed. One young man stepped from the crowd. He wore the green of fields, and there was salt in his hair, and he carried himself with the ease of someone who anticipated sleeping in the shade. He walked up to her with slow, respectful steps, but he never took his wide, expressive eyes from hers. "We sailed together," Zelda said, and it was true. She could feel the rocking of wood under her feet, the waves lapping against the hull of a ship, the sea's wind in her hair as the sun deepened the rich tan of her skin. "On your ship and mine we sailed together. We left Ganon at the bottom of the sea and found new lands, new worlds, new lives." He smiled up at her, and his smile was brighter than the sun. She did not always fight when the calamity returned, but she had fought with this hero, on the cusp of an old world swept away by the sea. He stepped back, too guileless to be awkward, and another step forward. The second's eyes were sharp, measuring, wary, but when he looked at her he was respectful, not quite in awe. His hair was swept back beneath his cap, the blue of his earrings matching the blue of his eyes. Nervous to stand before her again, he looked at his teeth, and she half expected his mouth to be full of fangs, but they were a man's teeth, not a wolf's. "You walked between worlds for me," she said, "aiding those who our people wronged. In those days long lost to the twilight. 2 princesses you carried on your back, 2 worlds you set right, uniting light and shadow in a single purpose." The sky above her was orange and black, and the world radiated a calm that spoke of the gap between life and death. She was not afraid. How could she be? "We faced Ganon together, we 3, and so terrible was he that we thought the life of the twilight had gone out, but with a curse on his lips Ganon died, and we 3 walked in the light together, however briefly." The hero of the twilight nodded, and as he had done in those bygone days he averted his eyes and retreated, not out of distaste or out of fear, but because the weight of other people's eyes was too much for him to bear for long. Through this, Paya stood at Zelda's side, and Zelda could feel her companion's regard for her, for the vastness of her experience and for the things they shared through the connection they had formed. Recalling these heroes and the trials they had all undergone together was building up something inside of Zelda, a perspective that was being repaired like a wall, brick by brick. It wasn't her knowledge, exactly, it was something beneath that, something more fundamental, and even with the goddess's awareness she could not be sure exactly what. Perhaps near the end of her journey she would know more. Paya hoped the same for her, and that realization was something Zelda would be thinking on for days. A third hero stepped forward, and Zelda's heart caught in her chest. The goddess quivered inside of her. She did not have to see him, or to reach out with Hylia's senses. She would have known him blinded, in the vastness of a great void, through the veil of death. "We flew through the sky together," she whispered, and the forest was so still that her voice replaced the rustling of leaves. "And in Skyloft, we flew together, when we were children, with our lives before us and the world beneath us." She felt in that moment as she had felt back then, seeing him in his student's uniform astride his crimson loftering, the wind blowing his hair back, his eyes always on her as they'd been even in the days when they were children and didn't know the words to speak the things that filled the air between them. For that instant she was highly incarnate, the young woman who had loved him so fiercely in the days before the world had made itself known to them. "He strode the land for me. He forged a sword that seals the darkness, and the hero's soul that could wield it. He struck down the primordial darkness. You." He stood before her, and he looked at her now as he had looked at her then. She had betrayed him, though she had not known it at the time that love had blossomed inside of her. And when he had learned of her betrayal, he had not cared at all. His trust was deeper than a god's machinations, his faith was more resilient than the conspiracies of the divine. He had been so happy to see her then. He was so happy to see her now. She held her hand out to him. He kneeled before her, taking her fingers in his. "You were the first." Even in the calm of the lost woods, the mist pressing in from every direction like a promise of isolation, though it had seemed more sinister before. To be sure, Paya walked a few paces behind Zelda, eyes scanning in every direction to ensure that there were no threats to her charge. The trees smiled their ridiculous, toothy smiles, and the wood was quiet, but still Paya watched. She was still trying to process the fullness of what she had experienced, by Zelda's blessing, in the sacred grove where the Deku tree stood. Zelda's personhood was something like divinity incarnate, a collection of powers and perspectives that defied the limitations and ignorance of a mortal body, or a mortal being. Still, Zelda was mortal, she had made that clear to Paya, in word and in deed, many times. As a mortal, then, she had a mortal's understanding of experience. To Zelda, however frightening the idea of becoming the goddess was, however much she feared being changed, some part of her also thought of that experience as routine. She had done it so many times, now, that it was natural. Paya did not have that advantage and was still trying to unpack the vastness of the experience, and how drained and small she felt in the aftermath. Her mind could not contain the fullness of the goddess's knowledge in the moments that she and Zelda had been connected. She had been privy to memory and awareness of the heroes of the past, knew them as intimately and totally as the blood of Hylia did. Every name, every adventure, every battle, every moment of devotion to the cause and to Hyrule had flooded her and infused her, so that she knew the heroes better than they had known themselves. Once the connection was broken, once Zelda let go of the power and reality collapsed back into the mostly physical, that knowledge had started to slip away from her like dreams, the recollection of which became foggier with every passing moment. Walking through the mist of the lost woods, she wondered if that was how the lost woods were, a border between knowledge and forgetfulness. Not where one might lose one's way, but where one might forget the direction one was going, allowing forgetfulness to guide one away. There was a sound behind her, not behind them, but behind her, close enough that she knew instantly that whatever had made the noise was following her specifically. A day ago, she would have turned, sword out and shield at the ready, meeting the great Deku Tree, seeing what Zelda had shown her. She could not see the world as she had before. Nothing walks in the lost woods except what the woods allow, she thought. Paya did not call out to Zelda. She turned, and looked, and saw. Knowledge and memory slipped away from her with every passing moment, so she did not know the figure that loped out of the mist, the shadows hanging off of his shoulders like a cloak of hopes and sorrows. She did not know the golden wolf who stared at her with one shining eye, but she knew of him. She cast a look over her shoulder. Zelda had not noticed that she had fallen behind yet. Paya turned her attention back to the wolf, who was drawing closer still. She whispered, low enough that the other woman wouldn't hear. You fought in the future and the past for her. She watched over you while you healed the soul of another world. You returned to Hyrule for her. You fought Ganon twice for her. She paused to swallow. He died for her. The golden wolf carried something in his jaw as he drew closer. That something resolved into a leather pouch, which the wolf set upon the ground before stepping back and away. She stepped forward, not afraid, but feeling the weight of his presence and accomplishments. She didn't need to be told that he wanted her to have whatever he had set down, but her hand still shook when she took it, standing up. She did not open it. She could have. Knew that the ancient hero would not begrudge her curiosity. He had been curious once, hadn't he? Or was that just something she imagined, rather than something she remembered? But she was stayed by the weight of the wood, of the moment. That is hers, the wolf said to her. His jaw did not move, and his voice was that of a man unused to speaking. When the time comes, use it. You, messenger of the royal family, know how. Paya? Zelda's voice came from across the mist. She had finally noticed that she was alone, was afraid that Paya had been separated from her. I'm right here. Paya called over her shoulder. She did not know why, but she understood that this was a secret, and that in service of the royal family some secrets must be kept even from those most high. Don't worry, I can see you. I'll be with you in just a moment. All right. I'll wait for you here. Then, who knows how long it would take us to find each other if we were separated, whether the Deku Tree intends it or not. Distractedly, Paya wondered if Zelda would want to hold her hand again. They did not have a torch, now. Paya nodded to the wolf, who did not move. She rose, turned away, and walked to follow Zelda. The pouch was strangely heavy in her hand. The weight seemed more than physical, as if she was carrying history itself. What could the hero have given to her? By the time she took her 10th step, her curiosity overwhelmed her propriety, and she opened the drawstrings to peer inside. She stopped, looked over her shoulder. In place of the wolf was a man, imposing in the weathered armor of a leader beloved by his followers, staring back at her with his one sorrowful eye. He, who had carried the weight of 3 worlds on his shoulders, had invested all of this in the shy girl from Kakariko village. Paya. Coming. Paya drew shut the drawstrings, set the pouch against her belt, and ran through the mist to catch up with her princess. The path that they were running down now was long, longer than she could have ever believed, and the end was far ahead of them, but further than that by far was the beginning, across a distance trod by generations back to the dawn of time. Bluer than the sky, Paya thought. Was it bluer than his eye? Yes, I think so. She reached down, felt the fabric of the pouch at her waist, assuring herself that the ocarina was still there. End of chapter.